On August 6, 2002, these three men who had known each other for a couple of years at a local mosque got together. They basically went out for coffee at a Caribou Cafe coffee house. This was 10 months after the war in Afghanistan had begun, and at the time there were a lot of reports about the civilian casualties in that war, and these three were very upset about that. And they just started talking about sort of what they could do to enact revenge, or if they could do something about this and send a message, what would they do? And so Ayman Ferris threw out an idea about the Hoover Dam, and Christopher Paul, who was with them, thought that was a good idea, but maybe there was something else. And then the third man, Nuruddin Abdi, who was a Somali immigrant to Columbus, he said, well, what he thought would be a good thing to do would be to shoot up a shopping mall. Maybe that would send the right kind of message. This meeting, which was kind of a casual meeting, again, where they were just sort of tossing out ideas, this became extremely significant to their three cases. The following year, investigators came across Ayman Ferris. He was originally from Kashmir, had emigrated to the United States. He'd been in Columbus 5 or 6 years by then. Authorities came across his name during an investigation of another guy named Majid Khan, who was an immigrant to Baltimore. And Khan was associated with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the 9/11 attacks. And sort of through that investigation, they came across Ferris's name. And they came across this notion that Ferris may have been asked to check out the Brooklyn Bridge, see what it would take to bring the Brooklyn Bridge down. This is obviously after the 9/11 attacks. Turns out Ferris had actually visited Afghanistan. He'd been to the camps, some of the terrorism training camps. He'd met bin Laden. He'd met Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And so the FBI was obviously very interested in him. Ferris was questioned beginning in March of 2003. And during the interviews with Ferris, he mentioned this conversation that they had had with, that Abdi had had, and this idea of shooting up a shopping mall. And also the name of Christopher Paul, the third man at this coffee shop, came up. Authorities started to piece all this together, and eventually, in a sort of slow domino effect, the three were arrested and charged. So Ayman Ferris, the Pakistani immigrant, was ultimately pleaded guilty to 2 charges of terrorism-related crimes. He pleaded guilty in a secret closed deal in May in Virginia, May of 2003. The idea was that he had a lot to offer the government, and he might be able to get a reduction in his sentence based on the information he could provide. Well, unfortunately, his case leaked, and the government was forced to publicize his conviction in that June. And at that point, everything went to heck. Ferris was very upset. He'd lost his bargaining chips. Meanwhile, the government was extremely interested in Abdi, the Somali immigrant who was still living here in Columbus. He ran a cell phone shop, he had a family, and they were tracking him, and they became more and more concerned about this shopping mall threat. What's illustrative of the situation we were in then is, here's somebody who made a throwaway comment about shooting up a shopping mall. Unbeknownst to the people of Columbus, what that led to was government agents spent weeks searching every mall in Columbus at midnight. They would descend on malls with search dogs, SWAT teams, looking for anything, maybe he was going to set off a bomb. And so there's something a little bit comical about this notion that there might be bombs sitting in these pretty luxurious shopping malls in Columbus. But it shows you that the government simply couldn't take anything for granted. And so one throwaway remark led to this massive outpouring of investigations. Meanwhile, the FBI was having a huge debate in Washington with immigration authorities. Can we arrest this guy? On what basis can we arrest him? We don't have a warrant yet. So there was a big legal fight in Washington, and eventually the decision was made to arrest Abdi the day after Thanksgiving, first of all on immigration charges, and then ultimately, after about 3 days of nonstop questioning, he acknowledge the conversation that had been at the coffee shop, and ultimately he was charged. He was on his way to morning prayers when he was arrested. His family didn't see him again for 6 months, and he actually wasn't charged for another, gosh, almost 8 months. So a lot of us in Columbus remembered Iman Ferris, but we didn't realize there was this other case pending until April of 2004. Now the third guy in this trio in some ways is maybe the most fascinating. He grew up in Worthington, which is a suburb of Columbus. It's one of the oldest suburbs. In fact, it's older than Columbus. He was one of a small number of African Americans in this suburb, but he grew up in a pretty close family. Went to Ohio State University. He underwent a conversion to Islam and he became radicalized. This was when the Soviets were still in Afghanistan, and there was a lot of concern among Muslims about the atrocities the Soviets were carrying out. Ultimately, Paul Laws changed his name. He became Abdul Malik Kenyatta. He went to Afghanistan. Like a lot of, they call them the Afghan Arabs, Muslims from around the world who went to Afghanistan to join the fight. He was over there. He became fairly radicalized. Ultimately, he returned to Columbus. He married a Pakistani woman who'd been born in England. He changed his name again to Christopher Paul. Nobody knows exactly why, but the assumption was that he wanted a more sort of American-sounding name, something that might actually distract people from who he might be or what he might be up to. He stayed in Columbus, but he stayed in close contact with terrorist cells in Germany. He did travel to Germany, and at some point he crossed paths with people who had direct contact with some of the 9/11 hijackers. There's no evidence Paul had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks, but he was on the periphery of those circles. And then through the decade of the 2000s, he was here. He was living kind of a quiet life, but at the same time he was still involved with these radical notions and radical people. The FBI took a long time to arrest him. All three were charged essentially with what's known as material support prosecutions. So the terrorism law that was seriously beefed up after 9/11, and this law has been used widely. It charges you with providing support to terrorists. What's controversial about it is that it doesn't necessarily mean you did anything. You didn't commit a terrorist act, but you provided aid, supplies, money, sometimes even yourself as a foot soldier in the cause of terrorism. Christopher Paul would be someone you consider a very passionate, ideological person. Also, I think probably a pretty honorable person. He really didn't fight his prosecution at all. There were a few court filings, but essentially he agreed to plead guilty almost immediately. He refused to testify or offer any information that might help him. So he's now in federal prison serving a 20-year sentence. Nuruddin Abdi, the Somali, received a very light sentence because the evidence against him was probably pretty thin. And he's actually scheduled to be released in this summer of 2012. His problem is he's not a U.S. citizen, and Somalia is still not really a functioning government. Part of his sentence was to be deported to Somalia, but it's unclear if that can even happen. Iman Ferris was never tried. He went back and forth with the FBI and then ultimately government prosecutors. He essentially struck a deal, and the deal was that he would plead guilty to 2 of these material support charges in exchange for his continued cooperation. And he agreed to this. There's a full transcript of his plea hearing where he agrees to all this. It's only later that Ferris got cold feet after his case became public, and suddenly he had nothing. He wasn't worth anything to the government anymore. At that point, there was a long court battle with Ferris where he tried to withdraw his plea, and then he tried to have his conviction thrown out. Ultimately, he lost on pretty much every level. Ferris is also serving a 20-year prison sentence. He's in the federal supermax in Colorado, and some of his cellmates are people like Robert Hansen, the infamous FBI spy, and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. These are 3 pretty good examples of what the government was trying to do after 9/11. They were under enormous pressure because of the attacks, obviously, to make sure that nothing like this happened again. This material support statute they used had existed before 9/11, but it was beefed up and added to. I think the prosecutions point out that the government felt it had to go after every lead, no matter how minor it might have seemed in the end. There's a lot of people who think that it was a stretch to go after Abdi for mouthing off about shooting up a shopping mall in a coffee shop while he's sort of shooting the breeze with some friends. I think what it shows is this complete change in the government's approach to investigating and prosecuting. John Ashcroft, the former Attorney General, made it very clear when he began to change the rules of investigative engagement. He said, we are no longer going to start in the rubble of a terrorist explosion. Our job now is to prevent those types of things. And in the prosecutions of Ayman Farris, Nuruddin Abdi, Christopher Paul, that's clearly what you saw. They were going after people who had not done anything violent in the sense of committing an act. They wanted to go after these people to stop something from happening, and I think these are probably three of the best early examples of them trying to do that. When I set out to do this book, one of the first things I wanted to do was basically illustrate how this was a national story that happened to unfold in Ohio. When people look into my book, I hope they don't think of it as an Ohio story. This was a national story that happened to take place in Ohio.